Welcome to all of you to this important session. Militarism and heteronormative gender identities are constitutive. It is not that masculinity generates war, as the question has been put, but rather that the process of militarization both draws on and exaggerates the bipolarization of gender identities in extremis. I decided to use this quote by Professor Amina Mama as a way of introducing her, even though Shai will do that introduction in detail. But I thought it was apt because, in a sense, this question she was addressing falls little on the question that we'll be reflecting on today, in its broader sense, the issue of security. But Professor Mama, as some of us have known her, apart from her academic prowess, she has been an activist. And an activist particularly on almost a question that is always made an appendage in the discussions that we always have, as though it doesn't exist, the gender question. I'm happy, though, that in this conference, while there's a distinct issue that she's going to address at the end, the issue of gender has permeated our discussions in a number of presentations today and even yesterday. And I just hope that that will continue to be the mark of what ALC is about. Mshai, over to you.
Thank you. We were actually just whispering amongst ourselves with Godwin and saying, that is such a beautiful introduction. I don't even know if we should do anything beyond that. But the reason that I think it is important just to say a little bit about Professor Mama is, even though we know each other and we know who she is, it is good to rehearse, like we said on the first day, what we have done and the places that we are coming from. And I'm very, very aware, like I said, when we had a group of media here, how many people said, but security is not a woman's arena. Women should not speak, should not be there. Not in a bad way, it just is not. And so it is with such deep pleasure that I would like to introduce Professor Mama to you. Amina Mama is professor and former director of the Women and Gender Studies program at UC Davis. Professor Mama was the first Barbara Lee Distinguished Chair in Women's Leadership at Mills College in Oakland, California, and previously held full-time positions at academic institutions at The Hague, where she was at the Institute of Social Studies, in Britain, where she was at the Development and Project Planning Center at the University of Bradford, and South Africa, where she served for 10 years as the chair in gender studies at the University of Cape Town's Africa Gender Institute. Whilst at the University of Cape Town, she initiated the flagship graduate program in gender studies and led a series of continent-wide research, curriculum development, and publication projects. Amina Mama serves as the founding editor of Africa's first continental feminist scholarly journal, Feminist Africa. In the course of her career, she has engaged in policy advocacy and community activism, development consultancy, and many, many other things. As you said, she's an activist. She does hold a doctorate in philosophy in occupational and applied psychology from Birkbeck College, University of London, a Master of Science in Social Psychology from the London School of Economics and Political Science, University of London, and a Bachelor of Science with Honours in Psychology from the University of St Andrews, Scotland. She currently chairs the Board of Directors at the Global Fund for Women. And I'll tell you why I'm doing this, Amina, is that we've been having discussions on mentoring with the fellows and asking about where are the spaces that academics can move and make impact. And that's why I think it is important that we do this. I know it's embarrassing. I'm feeling Fumi feeling you as I read this. And she's also on the board of directors of the Institute of African Studies in Ghana. She is a participant on the editorial and advisory boards of academic journals in the areas of feminist studies, development studies, and human rights. I wanted to also say that her research interests are feminist theory, activist research methodologies, and women's movements, international development studies, militarism, social transformation, organizational development and change, and the politics of knowledge. And she has led and conducted gender research in Nigeria, Ghana, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And I have cut it short. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that very humbling rundown. I mean, at my age, you actually do begin to forget, so I appreciate it very much. But I'm actually going to start for me. No, Allah, you know, so embark it, means I want to add my own little bit. Thinking and talking are actions. It's a question of context and strategy, and for me, understands this extremely well. She's also understood leadership in all its depth, and I think the biggest test of successful leadership is that when you can leave after 5 years with the confidence and grace and accomplishment and the kind of person that you have succeeding you, I think that is, for me, the ultimate definition of leadership. And I do think that your pedagogic strategies, your style, your personality, but also your very profound understanding of the importance of joining dots across spaces, across sites of power, between theory, practice, and policy, is the core. This is the triptych of resistance that we need all over Africa. It's been tried lots of places. I think our generation have understood this, but very few of us have managed to build something that we hope will be strong, durable, and for all of Africa. And those of you who know me from before know that I've tried, but never has this. This is why I like coming here. The accomplishment makes me, it's healing for me. It makes me feel, yes, we can, it's possible, because it's been done here. And we might try, so let's celebrate that. And real intellectual leaders have, for us in Africa, we can't afford to be discipline-based specialists in remote institutions. In fact, being there doesn't make you feel too good, I promise. What we have to do is be public intellectuals. It's not a choice. We have huge privilege. With that comes huge responsibilities. And if we're sound of mind and body, we know this. So it's like breathing for me. And I just want to congratulate you. Okay, so while you reflect, I'm going to show a few pictures. I think, where is she? Zida was saying, reading books without pictures. Well, those of you who know me at 4 a.m. know that a lot of our people don't read books, so it led me to think visually. So I started doing a few films. This is not a film, sorry, no funding. Slides. So I'm just going to, I want to just run the slides for you to reflect, and then I'll do the lecture, if I may. Bring the lights in. I think most of you will recognize the pictures, so I won't speak unless there's a reason. Some of you may think some of the girls got released. These are different girls. Liberated from a baby factory. I would like to draw a connection in another part of Nigeria. South Africa. They were already in Afghanistan. What is a military occupation? Violence against women escalates. So my title, The Gendered Production of Insecurity. Subtitle, Thinking Beyond the Men with Guns. A question, whose security? Who pays for it? Who profits? Global approaches to security manifest new post-colonial iterations of Western state-centered militarist traditions that frankly have not served us at all well. Beyond the state, globalization has so far been a profoundly divisive process, both in terms of the widening inequalities between North and South, and in terms of the ongoing conflicts across and within the national borders of Africa, the Middle East, and other conflict zones of today's world. In fact, there is ample evidence that the existing security systems may even contribute to insecurity. Certainly, we know that insecurity leads to more security, and there's a cyclical reinforcement and an overtake of the political space by securitization. And then nowadays what we're seeing is the militarization of society, the vigilantism, the proliferation of non-state uses of coercive force, variously organized, locally, and interconnected with global networks that have proliferated in the context of marketization and deregulation. A bit of history. Basically what I'm going to do is give you an historical materialist reflection for the sake of conversation. So I, like everyone, others before me, I'll recap history and thank those who've already shared historical points and contributions to today's debate, because there is absolutely no way we're going to untangle this mess if we don't take a long view back and think visionary, far ahead. Just to recap, as Ibo mentioned on the first day, I think, when the map of Africa was drawn, it was drawn to divide any coherent existing political and economic entities, and its political geography was completely the product of external interest. The old white guys sitting in Berlin. So Africa was willfully balkanized into ungovernable and unstable entities in a system of insecurity that has been enforced and sustained by military might ever since. The creation of our own nations and the central role and purpose of the military in this project, as Ibo mentioned, was thus a setup which Africa has never recovered from. The violent fragmentation of our hugely diverse societies was subjected to this, and it was institutionalized in nation states that were not nations in terms of coherence of peoples, and which had no imagined community or national identity, and were never intended to be coherent or viable sovereign nations that could actually stand alone and go to war with one another like the Western nations, out of which modern statecraft was formed. Instead, the whole setup, with its limited infrastructural and social development features, were all designed to sustain the cultural and intellectual abjection of Africans, and to facilitate the continued exploitation of our many human and natural resources for Western profit. That's not to say there were no good and valiant critics. Some Europeans, and of course a growing pool of educated Africans, have always pointed these structural factors out, but not necessarily focused their attention on the militarist project that established and sustained the entire edifice, or on the militarist anti-intellectual ideology that even now prevails among African leaders. This was a policy of deliberate destabilization, the production of insecurity. It was reliant on a class-based racist and sexist ideology that, following the transatlantic slave system, sustained the dehumanization of African men and women, and we heard yesterday, young people, often by playing gender politics along with ethnic politics and other divisions. So violent conquest succeeded by administrative pacification, to coin Hannah Arendt's and Ruth First's term. Administrative pacification oppressed and dehumanized colonized people to facilitate the extraction and exploitation. So the colonial regimes were basically the first of Africa's many military regimes in the modern era. Military power and the assumed monopoly of coercive force lies at the heart, as was pointed out, of the Westphalian patriarchal state and the externalized capitalist economic system that was imposed through this coercive system. So from the days of company security and mercantilism, the present actually resembles that more than the Middle Years. I'm speaking of militarism because it's a broader concept than security. It refers to the processes of militarization, and we define it to include its cultural and ideological characteristics, the questions of consciousness and culture. In this case, patriarchal, racializing, elitist, and it refers to those in conjunction with the political and economic features about which much has already been written. So the concept offers us a broader and deeper perspective. I would like to think a longer term framework than that afforded by conventional, often reductionist notions of security that have actually obscured the historical and material conditions sustaining chronic insecurity at many levels. This is important if we really want to discuss state-society dynamics of security and insecurity and how these are produced. It's important if we want to interrupt the ongoing dance between these two mutually constitutive forces. Insecurity feeds the security apparatus, which carries powerful vested interests that span state, market, and society. Social actors who emerge to take up violence can be progressive, my reference yesterday to national liberation, guerrilla warfare, but they all emerge out of historical and material conditions of deep contradiction, and they all seem to me to be engaged in difficult struggles to identify and define their place in history, using whatever means at their disposal. And I noted yesterday, my interruption, violence and despotism are the weapons of, no, that wasn't what I said. Violence and despotism at state level are the weapons of states lacking authority. Non-state actors lacking the power and resources to mount conventional armies to contest for power and find themselves invented guerrilla warfare, currently demonized as terrorism by a West that learnt a lot about insurgency. We taught them. They learnt about insurgency in Vietnam, in Algeria, and of course here in Kenya. That film, Battle of Algiers, is used in training US troops in preparation for the Iraqi invasion, for example. The French loss has been used to train, and I dare say it's part of why they so need the rest of Africa. They'll never get over being defeated and kicked out of Algeria. So we've taught them. They've learned about all our struggles, and they're now ahead of them in many ways. So a critical post-colonial gender perspective on militarism makes visible the patriarchal state-centered global regimes of insecurity that have gained ascendance. The global militarist regimes, in parallel with the global economic regime of market fundamentalism, are deeply problematic for the African region because of our positioning now as a continent of conflict, in the post-colonial world system. Post is also in brackets. Africa is one of the 21st century's prime theatres of war, marking a shift in the location of the killing fields following a 20th century in which over 231 million people died as a result of war. Significant numbers of those 20th century casualties were European and US citizens. The casualties of today are located mainly in the south. So militarism, I would suggest, is a very powerful and useful analytic. It offers an interdisciplinary analysis and brings it to bear on very far-reaching security challenges that threaten and undermine both state and civil society. A critical gender analysis of militarism allows us to think beyond the men with guns, beyond the barracks and security institutions, and to address the inflection of security challenges by diverse and contradictory interests and the forever gendered power relations of class and status. It allows us to address the production of inequality and the cultural tolerance or intolerance for violence and injustice. Nowadays, as leading post-colonial feminists agree, one cannot just focus on the woman question, or even just on gender, the man-woman question, without also simultaneously attending to the manner in which these complex structures of power interact and change according to cultural, historical, and material conditions. Thus, to illustrate, women who are poor are more vulnerable than elite women. And depending on the context, it may be more dangerous to be a woman of one faith than another, even if you don't go to church or the mosque. It also allows us to take cognizance of the fact that women are not just victims, but also capable of fighting. Not all men are militarized. Many are victims too. And indeed, poor rural men or poorly equipped soldiers are not less vulnerable to violent attack than women. There are still far more male casualties of war, even as international attention seeks to sensationalize and address the unsurprising historical fact that sexual and gender-based violence has always been a key feature of war. It's also a persisting feature of peace in modern societies, as the dreadful statistics confirm. There's a new survey to come out from UNECA looking at 8 countries. 30% is the lowest average, and they reckon underreporting is about 90% in terms of women subjected to abuse, personal abuse and violence in their homes and communities. As I noted, African states were set up to cut across existing formations, to disrupt social and political coherence, because these were threats to the security of Western interest. They were set up to politicize cultural and religious identities and foment identity-based rivalries, tribalism, clanism, sectarianism, about which there's fluidity. But these identity insecurities are not just a simple matter of colonial mentality, but today they're a corollary of the fact that African states have simply not developed the complex apparatus that it took to generate singular national identities and imagined nations of patriots upon whom the Western nation-state is premised. It took a lot to do this in Europe. It's not been done here. Thus, we remain in a state of ontological insecurity, subject to shifting cultural and political hegemonies that manifest in ethnic, religious, class, and other violences, and reflect economic contestations and disparities. Today, corporate security operatives attack and rob the stalls of women cloth sellers in the markets, while border security guards do the same at the borders, while women try to earn a living through trading systems that date back through the centuries. The trafficking of women, manifest in the 2 tales of abduction in the first 2 slides, has proliferated with globalization and deregulation, along with an illicit trade in drugs, weapons, oil, coltan, and other precious resources that should, if there were any justice in the global economic system, have seen Africa emerge into its own. Instead, we're pitifully described as being afflicted by a resource curse. I want to say that this curse is not an affliction, but it's been inflicted on Africa by the global systemic forces and powerful external interests in concert with regimes that, quite frankly, still don't have our people's interests at heart. So an anti-militarist position, which I hold increasingly, condemns a global system that inflicts poverty, inequality and violence on the less privileged majorities of the world, distorting social relations, taking normative sex-gender relations to new levels of commodification and perversity. It condemns the societal disruptions and resource appropriations that accompany militarism and provide the justification, for example, for the US military presence in Africa. Correction, since we're not convinced by this, let me say that this is the justification that is presented domestically to US taxpayers funding their operation, along with other strange ideas, including the ahistorical representation of African men as the world's worst perpetrators of rape and sexual gender-based violence. The concept of militarism I'm applying here also offers us a critique of conventional wars fought in places that are considered to be at the margins of the global capitalist system. It reframes our understandings of unconventional wars and redefines security and insecurity by placing people and their desires for security center frame. So from an historical materialist perspective, the colonial security agenda was designed by maintaining pacification to promote external interests. Ruth First actually taught us this in the 1970s. Pacification was a willfully erroneous word for a thoroughly violent process of securitization that had nothing peaceful about it. Pacification, my foot. The language, listen at the language. While women were considered little more than a nuisance, hundreds of thousands of African men, I think French Sudan, 275 or 375, 100,000, were militarized, whether they were recruited by the British, conscripted by the French to maintain that domination and to service the wars between competing European powers. One of the research questions might be, what was the social and societal impact of such a vast removal of able-bodied men from a fairly thinly populated region of the world? I haven't seen the research. It's part of what's been lost to history. But we can surmise that it had a profound impact on the sex-gender relations and responsibilities of the populations, as did the return. Eckenberg's work is good on that, as is Sembène Ousmane's film. In the international development field, it's been well established that Western sex-gender assumptions, man the soldier, man the farmer, man the administrator, man the politician, excluded women from civilized political and economic life, with gendered effects that have played a significant role in Africa's underdevelopment. The gendered inequalities orchestrated through development are registered in conversations about the feminization of poverty, for example. Extend a critical gender analysis of the structures of modern states and the societies that these govern and militarize, and we can begin to see how Western sex-gender regimes have remained intrinsic to both. This means that regardless of whatever security arrangements might have existed before colonialism, and whatever gender divisions of labor these comprised, the modern militarized state remains an almost entirely masculine affair. Military rule was all male rule. I'd like to say that this isn't just a problem of numerical dominance that might be addressed by adding a few women in, as Cheryl intimated today, as the USA and Israel have indeed done, Liberia tried to do. Rather, it's a matter of the patriarchal sex-gender regimes, the cultural, ideological, and economic regimes, and the institutional cultures imbricated with gender power dynamics that are extremely hard to change. The expertise to do this kind of institutional change work is scarce, but without that kind of structural and cultural change, women's presence, even if it's a majority, will remain marginal, complicit, and untransformative, critical mass or not. Flag independence, we know, followed the devastation of World War II. I won't dwell on it. except to say there was no Marshall Plan for Africa. The United States only helped Europe rebuild, but there had been substantial costs of war borne in this region. And the reason that development was invented was because of the Cold War. A colleague of mine, Colin Leese, described the first development plan as an anti-communist manifesto. So development emerges out of East-West contestations, and up till today, we can see these still figuring. Plus ça change, plus ça la même chose. So began the decades of modernization and development, which the overall underdevelopment of Africa has never overcome. No matter how wealthy the lands, no matter how resourceful colonialism survivors were. In other words, the world system that was consolidated at the end of direct colonialism bore the consequences of imperialism without undergoing any kind of structural transformation. The advocates of socialist and Pan-Africanist alternatives were variously eradicated and marginalized by coups, proxy wars, and the various shadowy means that thrived during the Cold War era. If male-dominated approaches to development focused on industrialization to the neglect of agriculture, women protested this and reasserted the importance of women's agricultural labor. By then, some of us were in school. This neglect is now widely understood to have been a factor in the development crisis of the 70s, which the elders here will recall was initially manifest as a food crisis and then rolled on from there. Indeed, the apparent, continued, and intractable crises, plural, led to critiques of modernization and actually opened space for critical gender analysis as one of the causes of development failure. And that continued through the SAP era, which Bio elaborated. The gender dynamics of SAP are far worse. Just to note that when you take away public services, those were the few spaces in which women were employed in the state, and women were the ones whose advancement depended entirely on having social welfare and educational services provided, including free health, access to contraception. All these things remove us from purely biologically ordained roles. So these then are the historical and material conditions that underpin the contemporary production of insecurity. I think Fumi summed all this up in a simple line. Security is a state of being. It's a state of mind and body, as well as of state and society. So I'll now move on and suggest a few remarks and possible research directions. The organic redefinitions of security have to reflect the gender differences of our societies. Women redefine security primarily in terms of access to food, water, basic resources, and freedom from violence and threat of violence, not just when they go to farm or in public, but also in the private sphere. And given the endemic nature of violence against women in the private sphere and in the communities, and particularly in urban areas, even in the absence of conflict, this subject does deserve our critical attention. Among us, we must ask ourselves, why are African societies so tolerant of violence against women? This escalates in wartime, and describing it as a weapon of war is not adequate, given that it's an intrinsic feature of war. But in our case, I think one of the arguments I would draw is the continuity between peace and war. And if you look at gender-based violence statistics, you have a data line that really forces you to understand why women question the security of peacetime. There's a continuum. So what happens in the moment of conflict is an escalation of existing dynamics of violence in our societies. And this vulnerability, this proclivity for violence and the enactment of violence and the subjection of, usually not internal to our community. I mean, this is where the ethnicity and the class and the religion come in. So the violence against women is perpetrated primarily as a matter of male identity. It's not actually about women. It is about a very lowered, almost chattel status of women. And women, like Africa to France, becomes a badge of grandeur, as you called it. It becomes a display of power. And among extremely humiliated, impoverished communities, the hunger for some exercise of power gets pretty desperate. as an analysis that looks at gender-based violence in terms of class, deprivation, and the collective historical humiliation of men in the context of a patriarchal paradigm that actually places responsibilities on them that they are unable to meet. It cannot feel good. So we need to include, where was I? Yeah, so women's definitions of security should be placed centrally because they also will inform us about the other dimensions and forms of violence. If we include societal violence in our analysis of state violence, put them together in the way I've just implied, the distinction gets blurred. The violence that occurs in peacetime, escalation, in the preparation for conflict, peaking during conflict, and then not really diminishing post-conflict, if the Liberian data was anything to go by. It means we have to look at the gender and class structures of our own communities, our economic arrangements, and the gender divisions within those, and consider how all of these are inflecting our proclivity to violence, and on the other side of that, the vulnerabilities of different groups within our very complex and diverse societies. So there's no one size fits all here. Although I'm arguing that there's an overarching framing that indeed generates insecurity. How we enact it is a much more local phenomenon and diverse. I've suggested security institutions bear colonial legacies that are deeply patriarchal. And that means, first of all, certain sex-gender politics, but it also means a certain treatment of men. It's a big man politic now, so that ordinary men are also vulnerable to humiliation and abuse. It's clear that although the conventional military forces have remained almost exclusively masculine and therefore imbued with very misogynistic sexual politics, the non-conventional military forces, such as the liberation armies, often involved much higher numbers of women, but even the detailed analysis of these alternative liberation forces, we're now very familiar with the fact that very nasty sex-gender things developed in the guerrilla armies too. And then, of course, post-conflict, I can't but keep remembering the Zimbabwean freedom fighters who, the newspaper headlines just a few years after, do they make good wives? The disposal of bushwives in favor of more bourgeois, better educated wives who would better adorn their political aspirations. Military regime after military regime has waged war on women. In Nigeria, we call it war against indiscipline, back during Buhari's time. Zimbabwe's had cleanup operations. Mobutu had cleanup operations. Who were they cleaning up? Women. So there's an ideological concomitant, blaming women for the societal ills and malaises and diseases, you name it. But that also produces a tendency to abuse and victimize women. Largely, that's pretty commonplace. And it's especially common in authoritarian, anti-democratic military regimes. So the neglect of the sex-gender dynamics at the heart of our insecurity actually compromise the possibilities for democratization and democracy. It obscures, it has a sort of foiling tactic. And the slide about Afghanistan shows you a global iteration. That young woman who suffered violence in her community, the Time magazine, what will happen to her if we leave? By the way, they were there. Let's just remind ourselves. But you can see the play, the cultural and ideological play of sex-gender politics now justifying the US strategic agenda, which of course is not our agenda. Why should we think that it would be our agenda? I mean, the naivety. I think there's a kind of willful ignorance by our leaders, because who would expect someone not to pursue their own interests on their own taxpayers' money? That's why in the US it's common to say other people's minerals are part of our national security interest and defendable. So if we decide to take our own oil and use it for ourselves, we've threatened their security. So they've always understood these connections between ideology, economic interests, and insecurity. It's time we woke up. They play the ideological, they play the military and the economic. What transnational feminist analysis do, they draw a triptych: the current era of globalization, economic neoliberalism, cultural fundamentalism, economic fundamentalism. And these three are busy reinforcing each other in the way that knowledge, power, and practice are co-constitutive. So think of the triptych and understand how these things work in consonance. I'm not drawing causalities here, let me be clear. I'm saying these things move together, and the fallout is what we're living out. I want to suggest that conflict has moved south. The theatres of war have moved south, and you saw the slide on weapons expenditure. As they begin to bring theirs down, and of course it's still much, much higher than ours overall, but as theirs is coming down, ours is going up. I think a global commodity chain analysis is helpful here. The question of costs and benefits. Who's producing the weapons? And as you see the marketization of state security, the US pulling the troops out, but Halliburton and all the corporations providing privatized security at huge cost. It's something like 10 times the cost to keep a private pair of boots on the ground. So the costs are high, but there's profit in it. So the marketization of security is a very serious issue. And the thing with it is that it's not accountable. If it's the US Army, even the US public can be mobilized, and quite often are, to protest and demand the withdrawal. But if it's a private corporate entity, it's shadowy, it's underground, and you're not going to be quite sure about which side they're on. In fact, interestingly, the US is worried about the recamp business, the AFRICOM project, which of course has evolved its face, as you will all know. But what they're worried about, they're fine with producing the training and all the weapons and delivering that to us. They're concerned that they can't quite work out which citizens are going to identify correctly. Because in Mali, they switch sides, just like that. So their own very superficial analysis is preventing them from really, or I don't know, I call it willful ignorance. The information is there, but not understanding or deliberately understanding and ignoring the fueling of the problem. I've argued that security institutions bear colonial legacies of the European regimes. And whereas we have many, many examples of women being fighters, especially here in Kenya, there's an anecdote there. When the Land and Freedom Army started involving a lot of women in Kenya, the British set up the Tanzania Women's Organization in Tanzania, specifically to domesticate Tanzanian women, because they're afraid they were going to be influenced by Kenyan freedom fighters. They didn't want a Tanzanian Mau Mau full of dangerous women. And the logistics, of course, was taken care of by women, and some even were fighters too, like General Muthoni. So they've learned across their colonies, they've modified and improvised the strategies, and it's high time we woke up. So I'm pointing to a research agenda there. There's a need for more in-depth historical research, looking deeper into some of these deeply rooted cultural and institutional dynamics, as well as looking at the symptoms and the global systems. We have a lot of deep work to do. Our role, and this is Claude Ake, one of our roles is to demystify the functioning of global processes in our own societies. We have to document and demystify specifically the complex local sex-gender politics of militarism in Africa. I think it's far easier for men to have been complicit in this project than for women who were excluded from it. And this may well explain the flourishing of women's peace activism, not just in Africa, where it's been very impressive, Sierra Leone, Liberia, but even in Europe, because women had less traction there too. So the first International Women's League for Peace and Freedom was formed before the First World War in an effort to prevent the European wars that then spilled over and involved us. But I think we need to learn something from that. There is a gender identity issue at the core of modern militarism. As you kindly used that quote, it's a short piece on militarism and masculinity, looking at who gains. And at local level, career opportunities. Think of the boys who are being recruited to Boko Haram. They didn't have any career opportunities. they're much more recruitable. And maybe they'll find some dignity in what they're doing. It's a horrible thought, but it's not an unfamiliar dynamic. It's just that this is no longer about any kind of national liberation. It's internalized, and it will keep proliferating unless we get to the local as well as the global systemic issues. And we have a huge responsibility there. The resonance between these local sex-gender iterations and the global scenario and its cultural and ideological appropriation of sexual contradictions are still being used to fool us. So if men in Africa do not wake up to this, we'll continue. And acknowledge the complicity, acknowledge the physical internalization, the embodied nature of complicity. And everybody wants dignity. So I'm not judging men. I want you to hear me well. I'm saying this is a historical and material insecurity instilled in men that renders all of us vulnerable given men's power in our societies. So within patriarchy, this is very, very problematic and destructive. So there's a big research agenda there. African states and societies, from my analysis, you can see, are all post-conflict, having been thoroughly militarized by colonialism, obviously in southern Africa, where wars were fought, less obviously in indirect rule contexts like northern Nigeria. And if I can take a moment to just say that northeast, you know, the British declared it impassable, so it wasn't colonized. Think of Tora Bora. It was a no-go area even then, and I want to suggest that the modern state continued to ignore and neglect. And that is why this morning on the radio, following 60 more abductions, I hear the locally elected representative saying, yeah, he can't even go to the village to condole the families of these latest victims because the military can't protect him. And they've told him, don't go there. We can't even offer you a security detail. Why? No roads, impassable roads that will render military vehicles incompetent and unable to find, etc., etc. But you can see, you know, there are probably many local, hidden and visible aspects to that issue. But the long-term deprivation makes it very ironic that analyze this, their clarion call is no Western education. I'm told that the leader does have a degree. It can be confirmed or disconfirmed. I haven't been able to validate that particular item. But the sad part is that they don't have a lot of Western. They never have had a lot of Western education up there. And maybe if they had, they wouldn't hate it so much. You understand? So the deprivation, it's just ironic. It's a very high non-literate community. This becomes a mobilizational strategy. So there's a research agenda there. Okay, how long? 5, okay. So now we're saying African state and societies are all post-conflict. So I think we need to reckon with that and the gender dynamics that made that possible and the plethora of insecurities that now continue to characterize ordinary people's lives and including the deeply lodged proclivity. If you're exposed to a lot of violence, I'm a psychologist originally, remember? The threshold shift. You become acclimatized to it. Then you have to unlearn it. And once people have, especially young people, going back to yesterday, have been trained to be killers, how do we untrain them? How do we put humane values back into deeply traumatized next generations? So this is a question for all your alums here. How we need to find ways of de-schooling large numbers of traumatized youth. Because right now, the boys from Liberia and Sierra Leone are being hired by the private security operatives and being employed in Iraq because they've still not been to school. Structural adjustment is being imposed. There's still no education for them. So the only work they know is killing. Those are the ones on the front lines of the security industry in Iraq and Afghanistan through the private sector. So we need to map and follow these things, these movements, these circulations, and how they're denuding and preventing the emergence of much stronger, more value-based societies. So the historical and materialist analysis locates African insecurity in these long-term inequalities and injustices that are efflorescing in the contemporary moment the general subordination of women and other marginalized groups according to the specific identities of privilege, unprivilege, and increasingly of abjection. So these different forces inflect one another, they interlink, they feed each other, they're complicated, they're context specific, and they change over time. Ethno-nationalist identities in one decade will be displaced by religious identities in another, but all of these are about power and inequality expressed through different cultural tropes. And given the fact of male domination, women are very often treated as the sites for the exercise and demonstration of power by men. So in accordance with what an American philosopher called Iris Young calls a masculine logic of security that casts men as heroic protectors and women as passive victims, women's bodies become the currency in patriarchal contestations between men along the tropes of creed, tribe, and greed, and often need. Let me be kind. So women are no longer the mere spoils of war, as in conventional warfare. Instead, women are caught up in these post-colonial conflicts that are now the key site for the enactment of violence and humiliation of men by men across various dimensions of difference. So there are many places across the region that have suffered and are still suffering violent attacks of many different kinds, and all the human insecurities that arise in contexts of deep poverty, economic and livelihood insecurities, land insecurity with the amount of land grab that's going on, that will get worse. Climate insecurities affecting the land and the livelihood options of people in places up like the northeast of Nigeria. I haven't heard that in the conversation much yet. There are many places like this. The failure of the nation state is reflected in all of these incidences and all of these locations. They're all characterized by the under-provision of some of the most basic things that might have been expected from a nation state. Schools, communication facilities, infrastructure, the things that also make it possible to provide protection from violence. So these areas are not technically defined as stateless, but clearly they are effectively stateless, as very few of the benefits of being citizens ever accrue to these citizens. So in Nigeria's case, this insecure situation of ordinary people who cannot afford to fortify their homes and hire private security is especially galling given the huge wealth, the size, and the huge capacities of the population. And driving around Nairobi just the last few days, I can see it looking very familiar, increasingly familiar. So this is all of the major cities, and it's the architecture of inequity that we're now seeing. So to sum up and end, we inhabit a reality characterized by growing inequality, insecurity, and injustice that requires not just research, but activist research and social mobilization of progressive forces linked to that agenda. That's what it will take if we are indeed to resist insecurity, redefine security for ourselves, and move beyond mere resilience. Historically demonstrated huge resilience, but we need to get beyond that and free ourselves up to think, and then establish an agenda for demilitarization that can open the path for more democratic, just, and equitable societies and states that can be held accountable to these values. Thank you for your attention.
Wow. Thank you, Professor Mama. I would have decided to apply a rule that a lecture in my own way wouldn't have questions. It's the end. But in consultation with Professor Mama, we agreed that we would allow an opportunity for questions, for comments on her lecture. But can we give her another round of applause to say thank you. You took us through our own history to the present and also started to reflect on the possibilities for the future and the questions that we need to further investigate, if indeed.
So that, wow. I'll tell you, those who know me know that I'm not easily impressed, but I have to say that, and I have heard them all, but this is by far and for a long time the most highly intellectual, deep lecture I've heard for a long, long time. And I happen to agree 100% with everything you said. So, congratulations. That's all. I'm not asking any question. No comment. This is just great. This is just great.
Wow. Thank you. There's another person at the back. First at the back, and then to Rashid.
Let me add my congratulations, but add 2 points as well to that. Firstly, that the sands of the Sahara have been reaching for the coast of the Atlantic forever. The sands of the Sahara have been reaching for the coast of the Atlantic forever, and with that, bringing people together with conflicting results. One of the results is building of empires, another one is increasing conflict. And so Boko Haram is in that tradition that goes back to the Kanem Borno Empire and preceding that. And those trends teach us a lot, and we need to master those. The second point is that the British government, in its infinite wisdom, when it introduced indirect rule to northern Nigeria, signed expressly the fact that there will be no Western education in northern Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rashid.
First, again, like Boubacar, thank you very much, Amina. As there's a lot in what you said that I deeply appreciate as a historian, of looking at this within a deep, long historical overarching framework, so that we understand and get a sense of really what's going on in the continent. A couple of things that I want you to speak to just a little more. First, to reflect and also think about whether or not within sort of this modernizing and transforming landscape, which is rooted in considerable violence within African society, whether or not there are practices, there are cultures which provide or can potentially provide not only resistance, but sort of a countervailing, but also positive vision of how we as Africans, as the continent, can reimagine itself beyond this. And just again, as you speak to that particular point, one of the issues that you raised yesterday that I thought should also be very much part of this conversation, and it's related to that, is how do we, I don't know whether it's contribute or disrupt or think about usually the way our conversations go. SSR is we sometimes don't fundamentally question the paradigms. What we do, we act within dominant paradigms. So again, complementing sort of the first question and comment, are there strategies and tactics in which, as we think about these particular issues, of the way in which clearly at one particular level is we rupture, we disrupt, and we insert our own paradigms insofar as this conversation around security, development, and society is concerned. Thank you very much once more again at the bottom of my.
Thank you. At the back there, on your right.
Thank you also, Prof, for a very insightful lecture. I just want to make an inquiry from you. As we insist on fighting for the underprivileged in society, and here we talk about women in some parts of the world and even men. And I'm glad you tried to see how some men are also vulnerable to the patriarchal system. And there's been a series of lectures also where Dr. Murunga has also mentioned that before. And I'm glad that you reiterated that. But my question then is, what is the aim that we hope to achieve for the underprivileged? Women who are underprivileged, men who are underprivileged. Are we just hoping to let them have education? And if they get the education, what next? I understand there's been a series of revolutions in the fight for women in some parts. Um, at a point, there was a cry for empowerment, where microfinance companies were set up to help women with finances and all. It got to a point where we were insisting on education for girls and everything. And then it gets to a point where people have education, both men and women, and yet the inequality still persists. There's still something we yearn for, which it appears we've not gotten there yet. We hope to get there. Can you, as a scholar, a renowned one at that, can you tell me exactly which point we are likely to get to, which you would say, yes, this is where we want to be?
Any other question? I'll take 5. Ole?
Thank you. Thanks again, Prof, for, I've listened to this about the third or fourth time. I think I've listened to you, and it's always provoking new ideas and taking us through very deep historical depth of ideas, and you're always looking towards the future, which I think is also something not common. You are not just diagonizing what the issues are, you are already, projecting to the future in terms of what can be done or what we need to be doing. My question borrows a bit from the last person who just spoke. Which? Sorry, I didn't.
Your name?
I'm Don Clement.
Don Clement. Don.
Don Clement.
I'm alumnus of the ALC.
Thank you.
Thank you. So my question, Prof, is when we talk about security, and also when we talk about, the other side or the twin piece, sometimes we talk at the level of utopia. And that level of utopia does raise, what is that objective state of security? Or what is that objective state of peace? And what is the benchmark, or what is the archetypal security that we are talking about? So, when will people in Africa be secure? Thank you.
Thank you, Ole. Professor Mama?
Okay, briefly. Yeah, you're quite right about the British government introducing the no Western education, Rashid. Yeah, I must put that back into my notes. I think it's a very telling point. They think they're so radical, and yet. And so many of our contestations are about atavistic things that were used against us. And we jump, it's part of what the heartbreak is about. In terms of sources of a countervailing vision, well, I'm looking to you, frankly, as well. I think it's up to all of us. I'm not going to sit here and profess that I have I can share with you the things that inspire me and some of the new questions at very best, but I think we need to work on that. And we've got a lot of work to do on it, and I think ALC is contributing in very, very important strategic ways to that countervailing vision. They're living it, doing it. It's perfect. More. No, you see, in the old days, and I still do, I very much admire Cabral for his cultural theory, the weapon of culture, and his understanding, his definition of culture as the way of life of the people. What could be more profound, simple, and democratic than that? But at the same time, Cabral also used to look to rural areas as the reservoirs of resistance to the bourgeoisification and elitism, thinking that those ones would be corrupted, the elite, but the society would recuperate itself by drawing on the reservoirs of all those less touched areas. So Boko Haram is causing me serious challenges on this front. And I think the reason is things have moved on. There, because of the incomplete nature of the colonial project, and this is, of course, countervailing, it's very exciting that it didn't succeed. And look, we're where we are today because it failed in lots of ways. I think we should remember that. But the fact of the matter is that contemporary neoliberal globalization has reached everywhere. And even the places of neglect are being pauperized and rendered abject by its forces. So there's now no longer a reservoir. I could be so depressed about that, because I'm someone who always liked going to the village, going to the bush, and now you just see it going down. And now it's less and less safe to even go. I mean, Cabral he would come up with a different proposal right now. Of course, the other reason I like him is that he saw women as a major source of psychological and cultural resistance. And I think that still holds true, and I'll come back to that, in terms of women's commitment to peace, to women's disaffection with modernist, industrial, militarist development. So I think we have good cause to say this is a huge resource if we listen and then use that to galvanize and mobilize, and I consider that part of my job. Then we will have a better understanding of what it will take to resist. So there was that. I had another thought on this. Yeah, okay, so the reservoirs of resistance. If the rural areas are in such a dire state, then this is exactly what we have to build. Okay, that leads me straight on to Don Clement's question about fighting for the underprivileged. Nuh-uh. I don't think we have the mandate to do that. And I'd like to say it's a nice idea, but it's a charitable idea. It's a good intention. And a lot of what has happened is passed under the rubric of good intention. So we can't actually do it for the underprivileged. The best we can do is facilitate their consciousness. And I'm saying consciousness and work in solidarity, support. Because if you go to any village, they understand globalization better than I do. I'm very serious about that. They experience it subjectively, materially, directly. And if you want to know about it, go and sit with an old market woman. She will tell you, she has a wisdom. I'm an intellectual, I study, I research, I put a few things together. But I'm saying deep, historically located wisdom. You can find it with our elders, and you can find it in, the who feels it knows it. They have a slogan, nothing for me without me. Because this has been the endless perennial problem. Things are done for us. We're somebody's burden, somebody's, the subject to someone else's manifest destiny. And so it goes on. So nobody can do it for anyone. It's about, so a liberatory pedagogy, which is what is being practiced here, would move from that position to understanding and transforming the kind of education. So it links to the education. As you say, education is not doing it. You're right. But then look at the kind of education. It's not what decades ago, we all knew that what was needed was not more conventional schooling, more technical and vocational education. That's just the least of it. That should all be there. But what really needs is the mindset. We've heard it said each day here. It's a kind of education. Conscientization was the word that was used, developed by Paulo Freire. And I think we can learn a lot. He went to communities, sat them down in groups and asked them to talk. Their history, their life conditions, and from there to action. That's radical pedagogy. That's, I think, what is being practiced here. And it's really the only way to teach. I said to Fumi, you know what? You teach, you don't preach. Now, you've made me do a lecture here, but I would rather be in the classroom with you doing that kind of work. And you put identity, economy, you put everything together, but you start from the person. So I think radical education is not what's been provided. Conscientization, no. Education, as designed in the West, was primarily about the reproduction of inequality. They developed the entire education system to reproduce class inequities, and those of us who went through some of that know that it also reproduced racism, sexism. Many of you here know this if you've been there. So our education system, if we were in charge of it, and we must take command of it, it will not do those things. It will do the opposite. It would dignify, empower, make us feel good about the endless positive things and talents and creativity and resources that are still here. They look hidden right now, but that's radical education. It's a radical pedagogy. So I think we do not want Western education. It's not served us well. We need to transform our educational systems, and every daily interaction needs to be founded in a different relational practice between teacher and student, a galvanizing practice. Thank you. So now I have to confess. You thought I came to talk. I came to learn, and I'm so excited by what I've heard here. Because don't forget, I'm stuck out there right now. So I came here greedily and selfishly, thank you, to learn from you guys. And I'm so impressed by what I've learned. So I want to throw that one straight, not the pen, straight back to you, all back to you, and say, this is our project. We must do, I have a thing about this, right? Transgenerational solidarity, across the genders, trans-ethnic, transnational, trans. We need to develop those paradigms that will give us the capacity to join the dots, to transcend the disciplinary silos of knowledge and activate it for our own purpose. So I have a big thing on education, that's why I work there. But it will also teach us that there's no easy answer. And going back to Fanon, we must all discover who we are. Njabulo Ndebele called it rediscover the ordinary. Understand who we are. Develop our subjectivity. As not as something imaginary, subjective. I don't mean biased, I mean subjectivity, our informed experience of our historical and cultural conditions. That is our subjectivity. And it's socially and historically constituted. That's the psychologist. You've called her out. But really, it is a different understanding of identity and selfhood that has to be at the core of this project. Because if we don't reckon with that first, we don't have anything to give anyone else. We don't have the capacity to love one another and care for one another. So I think this is very serious and needs to be at the center. And I would say most of why people like me as a teacher is because I help them feel confident and that something is possible. It's a simple recipe. Utopia, so that's also a comment on the objective state of peace. Come on. I think I've answered it already. I don't think there is such a thing. Peace is subjective, and it's different for every one of us. What makes me feel secure is not the same as what will make you feel secure. For many reasons, age, gender, location, and even the moment. So our understanding of security also changes. The more we have, the more we can hope for. That's the good news. Yeah, the more we can aim for. And that takes me to the last question. Utopia or dystopia? Well, the world is full of nihilistic, dystopic cultural products right now. And I mean, you only have to look at it. And I don't think it's just my age. I think there's some genuinely really nasty stuff going on in the cultural arena that is nihilistic. And it is not going to help us move forward. Which is why, in the end, I think we also all need to be cultural workers and activists. And I don't think that's utopian. I think we're tired. You know what? Dystopic visions are kind of boring. Elysium and, you know, film after film after film. I watch them on planes usually when I'm too tired to work. But the shit that I'm seeing out there, I mean, it's what it is. S-H-I-T. And you come off and you just feel tired and you don't feel rejuvenated. That's not what film should be about. And I think the same is true of culture. Culture is where we should inspire ourselves and change our relation, you know, enjoy our relational realities. So I don't think that's utopian. I think it's perfectly real. And the good news is that it coexists with all the negative systemic things that I've talked about. These things, you can always find them. Personally, I need to come home regularly because if I stay out there, I'll just have to write Africa off. So I keep coming. I've come here for food now, you know, a bit of soul food, replenishment, nurturing. And if you don't know you're doing this for me, I have to tell you, thank you. Thank you so much.
You'll agree with me that indeed we ourselves have eaten from what you have just served. So you came to eat, we too have done the same. And thank you once again, Professor Amina, for your insights, but also for challenging us on new areas that we need to focus to. Well, I'm in a fortunate position of being the chair for the last session, because I can have little privileges that I've not discussed with the organizers. In the conference welcome note, which all of you have, two things were mentioned as the aims that this conference seeks to achieve. One is to benchmark the field of security studies in Africa by exploring the current state of the field and suggesting new future research pathways. I'm sure all of you would agree with me that indeed we have started that journey during this conference. We might not have exhausted everything else, but I think we have started to anchor. The second is to position the African Leadership Center in partnership with institutions like the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Nairobi as a key player in the regional, continental, and international networks leading thinking and advocacy around security issues. Coming to the end of this conference, I'm sure all of you will agree with me when I said, indeed, we have met both these objectives that the organizers at ALC aim to achieve. Mindful, of course, that this is a long journey. So we can't say we've exhausted everything, we achieved everything today. So today we can say we've taken the train to somewhere. As we engaged with the various papers, for me it was like packing the bags, identifying what type of clothing you want. Maybe where you're going, you don't know whether it's winter or summer, so you have to pack both in order to make sure that we are ready for the destination. In doing that, we were raising questions to the presenters, making proposals that indeed will ensure that the presenters, as they improve their inputs, they will take into consideration these critical questions that we have raised. But also, we identify new pathways. And I think that came also much clearer in this last presentation. Professor Amina was very clear in her proposals of what needs to be done. But there was something that was said earlier on by Abubakar, and it has been resonating, sometimes said or unsaid, in the way in which we're presenting the issue of memory and imagination. I think all of us have agreed that in order to chart this future that we want, our history is instructive, but also important. I can therefore say we've laid the foundations of positioning AIC. I can also say, as conference participants, we are and we've been this foundation. But also, we've agreed that the plans and designs are there and will have to be shaped continuously. As you know what the architects do, they give you first the draft, and then they go back again to improve the draft and send it to the quantity surveyors and change how many things you need. But what was interesting for me is that as we do so, we're also mindful of the materials that we would require. And these are our young scholars that we're growing. Because we're mindful that if we have to complete that house, we will need new materials, different materials, and therefore, looking at the mix of our young scholars and the expertise they have, that will help us to conclude and finish our work. But what was important about the foundation is that we took our old scholars who have been tested and seasoned. Because if you want to have a solid house, you need solid materials. And that's what we've had. But we all agreed in the various presentations that we made that we would continuously need to mobilize workers to ensure that indeed this house doesn't only have the four walls, but it also has the grass, it has the trees, has furniture, and therefore functional. And that came when we're looking at the relationship that ought to exist as we continue with this conversation between our scholars, as well as policymakers and our citizenry. When Funmi came up here yesterday, and I think that has been running through, she has been insisting on the conversation. And I was saying it's quite interesting. And as Amina was saying lately, she came here to learn and she likes teaching because she doesn't tell people or be the one who's talking. I was actually laughing and saying, you know, in a conversation, one of the interesting things is that at times you have one that must start the conversation. So when you sit under the tree, somebody starts, so don't feel bad. But what was nice is that this conversation was about our future. While the issue of security indeed was at the center of the discussion in its broad sense and as it should be, in my view, we also were trying to understand our own reality and gradually trying to formulate what will be our continental interest. I'm raising the word interest because when we were discussing, and rather when Ike presented in the beginning and raised some of the lessons from East Asia, there are a lot of issues that were raised critically by some of the participants here about understanding the context of that development in East Asia and also being mindful that there were certain other realities maybe that were not elaborated that needs to be taken into consideration. For instance, the cover provided by the US at the time to South Korea and Taiwan in particular. So I said, yeah, and I agree with all of them. The land to the tiller question actually exposes that even more when you look at Taiwan's land reform. But I wondered at the same time whether this shouldn't provoke us to think about confronting, maybe selfishly, what are our own national interests and continental interests? My view is we shouldn't avoid this debate. It's the debate we ought to have. So all of this history, which is so nice of what we've done in struggle for liberation and so on, I think it's a time where we need to then reflect and say, what is this reality? What is it that is our interest? As individual nation states, regardless of the discussions that we had earlier about how we came about, but that's where we are now. Continentally, what is this collective interest? And my view is if we're able to ask this deeper question, we will help ourselves to then say, how do we protect this continental interest? And maybe dovetail our national interest such that it does not scupper what is our collective interest. But what are our covers? It permeated as we were talking about certain things that if you look at this, this is good. And I want to make one example. If I were to take one cover at a regional level, in Southern Africa you had what was called SACU, Southern African Customs Union, which tried to look at a way in which you could assist landlocked countries to have a benefit out of your export processes. There may have been other issues related to that, given that South Africa was one that was close to the coast and therefore the road for export, which helped to ameliorate some of the problems for the region, albeit to a lesser extent. But somehow, I think the national interests of South Africa overrode the regional interest, and I would say greed came into being. We started revising the ratios, and Swaziland and Lesotho became worse off. But I'm saying it's very interesting to look at some of those because that protected a cover for landlocked countries. But we missed the critical importance of that cover and what it would do in advancing development in the region. And it was very interesting when South Africa was trying to push Swaziland post that decision on democratization, and the Swazis just looked at them and looked elsewhere and got the money and say, stuff your money if you don't want to. So I'm just saying that maybe we would also need to engage in these discussions about what is the cover that we can use to advance our development. We were speaking about China earlier on, and I was saying to myself, shouldn't we be looking at China as a cover? If Taiwan had US as its cover, but if you understand how that cover works, and I think that's where, in my view, the points that Ike was raising resonate with me somehow. Because having that cover, there were certain things that Taiwanese and Koreans had to navigate to ensure that they protect their national interest, using that cover as a base. Well, I said I would use my privileges as a chair to just sum, in my own view, what I thought we were doing. And I was saying to myself, all of us as we spoke, and I think it came out very clear when we dealt with the issue of the natural resources. And I was saying, you know, this is one thing that should make us acknowledge that Africa will remain a space that will be contested forever. So it shouldn't be a surprise that everybody, even those who left, they still want to come back in some way, because they know what we have. Even though some of your geologists have not picked up where another resource is, tomorrow they will pick it up. So those who don't have it would want to have it. The question is, this being our national interest, our continental interest, how do we strategically think about its defense, about its exploitation for the benefit of our peoples? Well, maybe that's the job of the intellectuals in this room. Amina, you said something very interesting as you were talking and recognizing Dr. O's journey. Hey, I had a nice name of Fumi now. She's no more Fumi, she's Dr. O. As you talked about her, you raised a very important issue in my view: African intellectuals as public intellectuals. You might have raised it in passing, but I think it's very important. And as you raised that point, it reminded me of what Professor Adre Ondendal said as he reviewed the book, The Future We Chose, which talked about the journey of the 100 years of the ANC. He says in that review, the earliest Native Congress in South Africa emanated from a meeting in the library in King Williamstown in 1890, and rooted African intellectuals guided and led the ANC for generations through various phases of struggle until it achieved its task of bringing dignified democracy to South Africa. In this review, I think what Odendal was reminding us was the role of African intellectuals. And he used it in the context of the ANC. And further, he actually looked critically at where we are now and where we're losing the rudder. So as I said from Monday, I said today, and during this conference, we've affirmed what Professor Andre said, the role that African intellectuals ought to play in advancing and defining Africa's independence, development, and well-being. Maybe some of us here in our old age, some of you young, as you mature, we would look back and remember the ALC meeting in Nairobi for its contribution in redefining our future, a future that we collectively choose with the peoples of Africa. Thank you very much for being such a good audience.